Chevy, the ball's in your court. If ever there was a time to try and save the season before it gets out of hand, the time is probably now.
Your Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at AgeOfLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support, and you have helped us become the #1 sports podcasting network out there. So thank you again for listening and subscribing. And for those of you who heard last episode, you probably know I'm a little hot under the collar. Things have not been going well with the Jets lately, and, there feels like there is one particular person who kind of has to wear this one. It is Kevin Cheveldayoff. And let's preface it right now. Winnipeg is one of the hardest markets to work in. And prior to the last year or so, I thought Chevy had actually done a pretty bang-up job getting this Jets team in a much more competitive state. So let's give him 100% credit for managing this team for many years in a way that has helped build a pretty sustainable, pretty successful model. But the problem is a lot of that success really sits in the regular season. And the past couple of years, the playoff success really hasn't matched up. So where do the Jets go from here now that they're on the downswing of this core and things look like they are starting to spiral? How can he save the season, and what lies ahead for this Jets team? Also want to give some quarterly report cards for this team. There's going to be some interesting ratings, some unsurprising ones, maybe some surprising ones you weren't expecting. We'll dive into all of that and some thoughts on the recent Moose winning streak. Is it real? Is it sustainable? And are we happy with how some of the kids are being used? Let's start off with Kevin Cheveldayoff, though. Right now, the Jets are currently out of a playoff spot, and, as of yesterday, that's not really shocking. Technically, it is by just a couple of points, so, you're not really freaking out necessarily, but you're probably not feeling great about where things stand. It is officially American Thanksgiving today, and for those of you who know about the myth of American Thanksgiving, I say it's a myth, but it actually is relatively grounded in reality. If you are in a playoff spot, you are usually more likely to make the postseason by this point of the NHL calendar than you are if you're not, right? Not really a shocker. This is about the first quarter of the way through the season. You've already started to see some stratification of the standings usually. This year is a little different. I haven't seen many years where it felt like the wild card race was so congested, and even the difference between the wild card and some of the number 3 and number 2 seeds in a lot of these divisions isn't exactly that split apart. It's very close. So the Jets are out of a playoff spot right now, but it's not the end of the world. Where I have a big question, though, is, Winnipeg is 3-7 in its last 10 games. And, Cheveldayoff kind of has to answer for this, right? He has built this core over the last several years. He has pulled off some miraculous trades from players who want out. But when it comes to supplementing this team with some genuine talent to help move the needle, last year's trade deadline, I thought, was one of the biggest whiffs of his entire career. This was a team that, look, it was never going to compete with a Florida Panthers in terms of elite depth, right? Even against Dallas or Edmonton, the Jets would have to win different ways than those teams do. That's fine. I thought you had Hellebuyck. If he figured himself out in the postseason and you added stuff on top of that to help make this team a much bigger, deeper matchup nightmare in the depth lines, you could find conceivably a way to win that other teams haven't. And yet, what we got was, a couple of depth players in Luke Shen and Brandon Tanev. I appreciate their service, but we all know that was not the kind of needle-moving moment that the Jets needed. Winnipeg was trying to swing for bigger fish, and we heard that Brad Lambert was a part of at least some of those negotiations. It didn't work, right? Callum Ritchie ended up being the big thing that got the Brock Nelson deal across the line. The Islanders leveraged the Jets, and we got left holding the bag, looking kind of silly. Bardown's tweet about the Jets loading up is probably one of the things that made me want to punch my monitor last year. But yeah, Chevy has to answer for what's happened, and he's really the only one that can fix where this team goes now. He has to make a choice, right? At what point does he look at this season and say, it is not worth putting in the chips to try and bring assets in? I'm kind of already reaching that stage and thinking about more of the future. I can also completely respect and understand if that's not where Chevy and the front office are right now. This team is still within touching distance of the postseason. But listen to Arniel's comments, right? He was asked in the game after the Caps won if he thought about splitting up the top line. This is a line that no one ever asks about, right? Asking about the top line is basically tantamount to the media saying there are very big problems with his Jets offense. And Arniel, we didn't outright refute it. He said, we've thought about it, but we're trying to challenge everyone else to do their part first. And I find that to be fascinating because it tells me, that, I think he is properly reading this team that the top line's the only one that can get anything going. And he needs more from everyone else, but I think he's seeing that there is nothing else to give. And this is where Chevy has to offer some support. If the top line is to stay together, and probably will, the Jets need help. There's just nothing else that you can say about this team. But I look at it as, we're kind of falling out of the playoff race here, and we're getting dangerously close to a point where the hill to climb back out is just too tall, right? You're looking at a hole that's very deep. Once you start getting into the December weeks and days, and you ask yourself, what do you realistically think this team can do? Somebody on yesterday's video was commenting about the fact that they feel, it's just not worth it, right? Last year's team felt like one that could conceivably go on a real deep playoff run. This year's team doesn't feel the same way at all. And I'm inclined to agree. I think I've been that way kind of since the summer, just because I looked at the summer acquisitions and look, I try to really spin it in a positive way, but I think all of us could kind of feel that there was at least some writing on the wall as to where, the season might be going. And I wasn't really keen on what I thought this team would do in the playoffs, not unless there was a big trade or some big move. Now we're not actually, guaranteed to even see the Jets in the playoffs. That's kind of how fragile things are. And conceivably, if Winnipeg starts to drop, even a couple of games on this road trip, which is likely at this point, we might not really be talking about the playoffs when Hellebuyck is back. You have to at least give him at least like a 500-ish record to come back to, while he's out. And I don't know that the Jets are actually going to be capable of that. The way they're pacing right now, they are not looking to be anything more than at best wild card 2. And that might be a bit of a stretch. I guess the one, nice thing to say is that the Jets are still within a couple of points of the wild cards, but Chevy has to start thinking about what he wants to do with this team. This is his call. He has built the squad, and it is up to him to try and either fix it or admit that this year is probably not the season to go for it and drop some assets while maybe trying to pick up a player or two that can help for the years beyond. The Brad Lambert situation's not great. There's probably some level of internal pressure from players to try and win now. You need to keep up your attendance and not lose playoff revenue. A lot of things are sort of sitting on his shoulders, and so far we haven't really heard any new, word from his office that they're into too much other than maybe looking for a depth defender. And I think if that's what the Jets do, it's going to really piss off a lot of people. So curious to know what you want him to do. I'm starting to lean more towards, pending how December and January go, being in a bit of a seller's mindset heading into March. I don't think this team has the horses, and I don't think they have the assets to go get those horses to bring to Winnipeg. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a surprise somewhere. Maybe Chevy has a Paul Stastny-esque move hidden up his sleeve that's going to save this team and turn things around. Let me know what you're thinking about his tenure so far for the past year or so. If you think he's got maybe a miracle Hail Mary somewhere, drop those thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. In the meantime, I want to assess where the Jets are at about the quarter mark of the season and talk about what they've done well and maybe where they still have room for improvement, all coming right up. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of the game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. You can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And of course, if you're somebody who's a big stats nerd or follows every piece of NBA action and news you can possibly take in, this is your chance to turn your knowledge into wins. If you think you know who's going to hit the most threes in a given night, or who might be winning the league's MVP award at the end of the season, turn your knowledge into big winnings, and there's even a special offer for you new customers. FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we're chatting about where the Jets are, about, the quarter of the way through the season, a little over that because it's an 82-game season. We just finished, game 22? It's time for our quarterly report cards, and going to be an interesting one, right? How I'm going to split this is I'll probably talk about the forwards, the defense, the goaltending, special teams, and I guess general coaching stuff, and the front office. Up front, the forwards, for the top line, I'm going to give them probably an A-. I think they have basically done just about everything they possibly can to keep this team relevant, and it is hanging on by a thread. They are doing as much as they possibly can. This has probably been one of their most superhuman efforts so far, and they're really fighting hard. Every other line, I'm basically going to give a C. I'm not seeing a lot of offense. I am seeing fairly strong defensive commitment, and, guys are trying to do a lot of the small plays really well. So I don't want to knock them for the lack of goals, but, part of me feels bad because I'm giving grades for production and stuff, even though I think a lot of these guys are playing up to their potential. Nyquist, Taves, a lot of these other players, I didn't really expect them to be world beaters. But at the same time, I also have to be realistic about what they've produced so far, and it's just not meeting the moment. Unfortunately, the only line that I can really give a pass to is like the fourth line, and maybe I'd give them like a B. But, everyone else just not really seeing enough. Lowry has done a great job defensively. He kind of feels like he's on a little bit of an island. Niederreiter's been fine forechecking, but overall, if I'm going to give the group a rating, probably a C. I mean, there's no goal scoring coming out of this group. And I think the top line is starting to lose patience with the fact that there's just no support. Every night, no support. So, not feeling great. And that's not necessarily a knock on the efforts on the players. I think they're all hauling arse and doing as much as they possibly can. This is kind of a Chevy thing. This is where he has to step up and do something to help this team out. On defense, top pairing gets an A from me. I think Morrissey and DeMello have tried to do their best, and especially Morrissey. He's been just lights out, Norris caliber, every game basically. Only a couple of nights where you'd see maybe him struggle a bit more. He's been tremendous. Sandberg, second pairing, I'd say probably B. A little hard to assess because there's been a lot of movement on that pairing. Before Sandberg came back, it was like C-. Now that Sandberg's returned, it's probably B-ish. Third pairing, probably a D. Usually not good. So you're not really surprised by that. The third pairing is what it is. It gets sheltered a lot once the game enters the latter stages. Nothing super surprising there. Here's where things maybe get some interesting ratings, right? So special teams, on the power play, I'm going to give it like a solid B. The power play in general, I think, has tried to compensate for the loss of Nikolai Ehlers, and that's kind of been a little bit up and down. Overall, I think the power play is still one of the league's better units. It's not as lethal as it was last season, and we all sort of knew that would be the case. Davis Payne is a bit of a miracle worker, but he can't, extract lemonade from every rock that he gets. I think he's done a pretty admirable job of trying to keep this group, producing. They've created lots of great chances. They've even scored a fair few goals. But at some point, the personnel departures are going to have a bit of an impact on the team. And he's probably extracted about as much as he can. So I'm going to give the power play coaching a B. I think they've done a pretty fair job. The PK, I'm going to give Dean's unit probably an A. or A minus maybe. They still concede a fair few chances, but overall, I think compared to the PKs that we've had in the past, this unit's aggressive. They take chances. They try to put pressure on opposing puck carriers. It's had a pretty tangible impact. Yes, I think a lot of the success has kind of stemmed down to Hellebuyck, but at the end of the day, I think he's done as good of a PK job with this unit as you can. I think Dean's really got them playing more disciplined hockey. I think they've been, very aggressive and tried to make teams uncomfortable. They've even gotten some shorthanded opportunities. So, overall, pretty happy with the PK. Now comes the fun rating, the front office. I'm going to be honest, this is probably the lowest rating I've ever given anyone before. It's getting an F from me. I don't ever hand out a rating this low without some serious frustration building, but I think, the Jets front office for about a year and a half now has really not met the moment. Last year's trade deadline kind of felt like the first precursor. You also had the Pionk contract, which I think the Pionk contract was very expensive for what we were getting with Neil's game at this point. And, as they continue to lock down pieces, I'm okay with them extending lots of guys, right? Lowry, Connor, Pionk, whatever. You sign them, great. That makes sense. But you have to build around that group, and I feel like the Jets just haven't even come close to doing that. Part of it is that, their asset pool to make moves is somewhat limited. And so I see that angle, right? But I also see a lot of frustration from some of the prospects also not really having a chance to just make the team. And I see a couple of different arguments here, right? On the one hand, some of the Jets prospects aren't necessarily at the level where I think they have an argument to get into the team over existing veterans. But the Jets also keep signing, mid-tier veterans who certainly raise the floor a bit, but don't help you raise the ceiling. And all of the kids that could help you raise the ceiling don't ever really get a chance to get a sustained run where they can prove that they deserve to be here. And so, you look at this from an outside perspective, and if you're a prospect in Winnipeg's system, where do you really see yourself in a few years? Because it's probably with the Moose. I don't think that there's really a chance for many kids to graduate to the higher levels, and the Jets haven't yet indicated that they want to change how they operate. And if that's the case, you risk alienating more young kids who have seen, Rucker force his way out. They've seen Laine force his way out. You have Lambert now who's probably forcing his way out. What does that say for, this so-called talent pipeline and draft and develop model? It's not producing the results that the Jets want. I think Winnipeg, for where they're picking, draft pretty well. And I've said that about their pool. I think given where Winnipeg is picking, they've got a lot of really solid prospects. And I think a couple of guys who project to be pretty good NHLers. I have a lot of time for Sasha Boumedienne. I've got some real time for Kieran Walton, Kevin He. I think Barlow will be some form of an NHLer, still figuring out what kind, but certainly an NHLer at some point. Braden Yeager kind of sort of falls in this I guess, pipeline. I struggle to say that because he is kind of an external asset when you think about it. But yeah, he's playing with the Moose, right? So I guess I'll throw him in there. Nikita Chibrikov, if he can get his head straight, he'll be an NHLer too. But you don't see a lot of top-end elite talents. Salamodson's probably one of our best hopes. And he's only really been called up because of injury, much like the rest of the kids. So I just don't see pathways here. And it feels like Winnipeg is stuck in this moment of stasis as all of their guys are aging out. And I don't know if Winnipeg really knows how to work itself out of this. And this is kind of a front office thing. I said in the last segment, the ball is in Chevy's court to sort this out. This is like an organizational problem. You now have a team that's old. It's not young. It's past 30. So with one of the oldest rosters in the league, how do you possibly expect to compete against all these teams that are moving in a different direction? They're fostering more youth development. They're getting those youth into NHL spots, and they're benefiting from it. The Jets have to be willing to do things differently than they've ever done before. Like this grade that I'm giving the front office right now can very much change if they rethink how this team's construction starts to evolve over the future seasons. This team, I think, does have the ability to pull itself out of this hole, but they have to rethink how they're approaching things and take some gambles in ways that I don't think they've ever done before. Is it going to lead to some moments of pain? Possibly. But I think right now, Winnipeg's not really going anywhere as is with this current group. And the more that guys get frustrated on this roster, I think the more you start to risk guys saying that maybe they want a change of scenery. You don't really want to run into that situation. You do not want to have a moment where guys are like, I'm done with Winnipeg. I want to leave. That could really force some uncomfortable gambits. And I think the players that signed and committed here want to see this front office really commit to that winning aspect. We keep talking about this being the 3-year window. The window doesn't actually open unless somebody gives this team some real support. So, balls in Chevy's court, it's time for him to stand up or figure out something with this team. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting next few months as we try and ride out whatever the storm is. At least the Moose are winning, though. We'll chat about how they're doing and what they're up to in just a little bit. Let's be honest, most of us can't name all of our financial accounts, let alone what they're worth. Between 401ks, savings, and investments, it's easy to lose track, and that can mean leaving money on the table. That's why I started using Monarch, an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch helped me organize my spending and figure out what subscription services I probably didn't need to keep spending on. And if you're somebody who's more investment savvy, maybe you've got a very diverse portfolio, Monarch can help you bring it all in one easy-to-use, visualized place that you don't even have to use a spreadsheet to track. It's convenient, it's fast, and it helps you bring everything into one suite of powerful tools. And if you're somebody who's also got a partner or spouse, there are shared accounts so you can always stay on the same page with those you love. Don't let financial opportunities slip by through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarch.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarch.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some recent thoughts on the Moose winning streak, or at least was a winning streak until they lost one game in between. They've basically lost won 6 or so of their last 7 games. We'll call the one game in between a little bit of an off night. But generally, the Moose have been performing a lot better as of late, right? And I know somebody recommended being patient with Morrison and not stressing too much about the losing that started the season. And I agree to a point with patience. I think one of the things that I've noticed with the Moose this year is that, when it comes to how they're deploying a lot of the prospects, I'm not a fan of it, to be honest. We've seen some of our players like Jaeger and Lambert and Barlow get into the bottom 6. We've seen, players like Jarrett Anderson-Dolan and a few others given top 6 billing. And while I understand having some of the more experienced guys in there, I think that the Moose kind of run the risk of being a little forechecking heavy in their top 6. And if the Moose are really supposed to be this development squad, you kind of have to give your kids more priority and more deployments. You don't want to see guys like Jaeger taking 4th-line shifts with Lambert. These guys are supposed to be your breadwinners, some of your blue chippers. And the way that the Moose sometimes deploy them, you don't really see that. I think in my mind, Jaeger has actually succeeded in spite of some of the coaching decisions. And, right now I tend to feel like the Moose are sort of succeeding just because they're so deep and talented. They've added tons of offensive ability up front. Defensively, they're relatively deep. They've gotten rebound seasons from players like Danny Jokin. You have David Gustafson now back in the fold, who's been honestly one of the most productive players on the team. You've got Fagemo, who's been a great finisher and had a couple of goals tonight. So I see the argument that they're doing well, and I think people are going to say, oh, that's great. But ultimately, I still want the Moose to be really youth-oriented in a way, right? You don't want to have a situation where guys like Shaw or maybe some of the more veteran players are getting more shifts and playing more prominent roles when, you kind of want your young kids to be the stars of this team. you sort of need them to, because right now the Jets themselves also need their kids to really succeed and show that they're valuable in the organization, especially if Winnipeg wants to send them to another team to help get the big club some real assets. I think, the Moose push to reform this team, make them more competitive, and give the squad some real firepower was to really emphasize the competitiveness for the kids. It wasn't necessarily to make this team a Calder Cup winner. It was to provide the supportive environment to help players like Lambert and Julian and Jaeger really thrive. And while they are playing a lot better recently, I have questions about the overall strategy and tactics for this team. And sometimes, I still feel like I don't know if Morrison's really the guy for this team. We'll have to wait and see, I guess, for now. I don't think that the Moose are really considering a change. I suppose they're happy with the results, but I do worry a little bit that, we're going to see some players who maybe should be getting more roles, right? Jaeger should not be on your bottom six. He's better than that. He's already become one of the Moose, I would say, most trusted players and most relied upon players, at least in my mind. And yet, they're still at times putting him in the bottom six and rotating, more players like Conley and Dewar and Fagemo up front. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't feel like that's the best plan, but curious to know your thoughts. At this point, I just don't think Winnipeg can afford to have too many seasons where Manitoba is really vet forward than anything. The Jets need their kids to shine. It's really critical for this team's success at the lower levels, and also for Winnipeg's own success when they start trying to play the trade market. And I know people will say, well, the Moose are a separate team and all, and we shouldn't just treat them like the development grounds for trades and prospects, but that's kind of what you need them to do. So going to be an interesting run for Manitoba. Hopefully, the kids start feeling more confident. Jacob Julian's coming back here pretty soon. I'm really excited to see him start to get some real reps, and hopefully he can kind of have a more successful season. Last year I thought was kind of from him in his final year in junior. It would be great if he can really start to prove that he might deserve a shot with the Jets at some point soon. So lots to watch, but hopefully for Manitoba, the overall picture is that you want this to be your fertile grounds to help make Winnipeg's future brighter. Love to hear your thoughts on the Moose so far, though. Have you caught any recent games? What have you noticed? Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Tomorrow's episode will have a preview of Winnipeg versus Carolina Part 2, and also do an overall prospect check-in just to see how the kids are handling things as we head into December, really just around the corner next week. It's almost Christmas time, almost Boxing Day for some of you. It's going to be nuts as Winnipeg tries to survive this next stretch and perhaps starts thinking about the future. But we'll see you then. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.